Imagine a country, a people, a culture, split right down the middle by an invisible line. This isn't just a political boundary, it's a scar running through the heart of a nation, separating families and futures. This is the story of the Korean War, a conflict that officially never ended, and whose echoes still shape our world today. To understand the war, we have to go back to the end of World War II. For decades, Korea had been under Japanese rule. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the Allied powers faced a question: what would happen to Korea? The solution they devised would tragically set the stage for conflict. They decided to divide the Korean peninsula along the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union would oversee the north, and the United States would manage the south. This was meant to be temporary, just a way to disarm the Japanese forces and help Korea get back on its feet. But the Cold War was just beginning to cast its long, icy shadow. The world was polarizing into two camps: communist, led by the Soviet Union, and capitalist, led by the United States. Korea became a pawn in this global power struggle. In the north, the Soviets supported a communist leader named Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current leader, Kim Jong-un. He quickly established a totalitarian state, building up a powerful army with Soviet backing. Meanwhile, in the south, the United States backed an anti-communist, but often authoritarian leader, Syngman Rhee. Two very different Koreas were taking shape, each claiming to be the one true government of the entire peninsula. Tensions along the 38th parallel were constantly simmering, with small-scale skirmishes becoming alarmingly frequent. Both sides dreamed of reunification, but on their own terms, and by force if necessary. The breaking point came in the early morning hours of June 25, 1950, with the backing of both the Soviet Union and the newly formed People's Republic of China. Nearly 100,000 North Korean soldiers stormed across the 38th parallel, their T-34 tanks, supplied by the Soviets, spearheaded the invasion. The South Korean army was caught completely off guard, poorly equipped, and quickly overwhelmed. The North Korean advance was stunningly fast. Just 3 days after the invasion, they captured the South's capital, Seoul. The South Korean government and its collapsing army were forced into a desperate retreat. Southward, it looked like the entire peninsula would fall to the communists within weeks. The world watched in shock. This was the first major armed conflict of the Cold War. The United States saw it as a direct challenge, a test of its policy of containment, stopping the spread of communism. President Harry S. Truman decided that the U.S. had to act. He bypassed Congress and went to the newly formed United Nations. In a stroke of geopolitical luck for the U.S., the Soviet Union was boycotting the UN Security Council at the time, protesting the exclusion of Communist China. This meant they couldn't use their veto power. The UN passed a resolution condemning the invasion and calling on member states to help South Korea. And so, a United Nations force was assembled, though it was overwhelmingly composed of American troops. Under the command of the legendary World War II General Douglas MacArthur, UN forces arrived in Korea. But they were walking into a disaster. The North Korean army had pushed the South Koreans and the first American units into a tiny corner of the peninsula, a defensive pocket around the port city of Pusan. It became known as the Pusan Perimeter. For 6 brutal weeks, from August to September 1950, the defenders held on by a thread, fighting desperately to avoid being pushed into the sea. The fate of South Korea hung in the balance. Then General MacArthur, ever the bold strategist, conceived a plan that was as risky as it was brilliant. Instead of just reinforcing the Pusan perimeter, he proposed a daring amphibious landing hundreds of miles behind enemy lines at the port city of Incheon. Many in the Pentagon thought it was insane. The tides at Incheon were treacherous, and the defenses were unknown. But MacArthur was convinced it was the only way to break the stalemate. On September 15, 1950, the gamble paid off. U.S. Marines stormed the beaches at Incheon, catching the North Koreans completely by surprise. The landing was a spectacular success. With UN forces now threatening their supply lines, the North Korean army that was besieging Pusan began to collapse. At the same time, the forces trapped in the Pusan perimeter broke out. The tide of the war had turned dramatically. UN forces recaptured Seoul and pushed the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel. Now a critical decision had to be made. Should they stop at the border, having restored the original situation, or should they push on, destroy the North Korean army, and unify Korea under a non-communist government? MacArthur, buoyed by his success, strongly advocated for pushing north. President Truman, despite some misgivings, agreed. The goal of the war had shifted from containment to rollback. As UN forces crossed the 38th parallel and advanced deep into North Korea, they were met with little resistance. They captured the northern capital, Pyongyang, and raced towards the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. Victory seemed within reach. MacArthur even promised the troops would be home by Christmas. But they had ignored repeated, stern warnings from China. China's leader, Mao Zedong, saw the American army on his border as a direct threat. He would not stand by and let North Korea, a fellow communist state, be destroyed. In late October 1950, something changed. UN troops began encountering fierce resistance from soldiers who seemed to appear out of nowhere. They weren't North Koreans. They were the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. In secret, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers had crossed the Yalu River and hidden themselves in the rugged mountains of North Korea. In late November, they launched a massive, surprise counteroffensive. The UN forces, stretched thin and unprepared for the brutal winter conditions, were hit with overwhelming force. The Home by Christmas offensive turned into one of the longest and most desperate retreats in U.S. military history. The fighting during this period, especially at places like the Chosin Reservoir, was unimaginably brutal, fought in sub-zero temperatures. The Chinese intervention completely changed the war. UN forces were pushed back, not just out of North Korea, but south of the 38th parallel once again. Seoul changed hands for the third time, falling back under communist control in January 1951. The war had devolved into a bloody, grinding stalemate, with the front lines moving back and forth roughly around the original border, the 38th parallel. This new phase of the war was characterized by brutal trench warfare, reminiscent of World War I. Battles for strategic hills with names like Pork Chop Hill and Heartbreak Ridge were fought with horrific casualties for very little territorial gain. Meanwhile, a major conflict was brewing between General MacArthur and President Truman. MacArthur wanted to expand the war into China, even suggesting the use of nuclear weapons. Truman, fearing a much larger conflict, possibly even World War III with the Soviet Union, refused. When MacArthur publicly criticized the president's strategy, Truman did the unthinkable. He fired the popular general for insubordination. It was a stark reminder that in the American system, the civilian government is in charge of the military. With the war at a standstill on the ground, peace talks began in July 1951. But they would drag on for too long, agonizing years. The main sticking point was the issue of prisoners of war. Many North Korean and Chinese prisoners held by the UN did not want to be sent back to their communist homelands. The communists insisted that all prisoners be returned, forcibly if necessary. While the diplomats argued, the soldiers continued to fight and die along the front lines. Finally, after the death of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in 1953 and a change in leadership in the U.S. with Dwight D. Eisenhower becoming president, The deadlock was broken. On July 27, 1953, an armistice agreement was signed. It was not a peace treaty, it was simply a ceasefire. It stopped the fighting and established a demilitarized zone, or DMZ, a heavily fortified buffer zone near the 38th parallel. The Korean War was over, but it was never officially ended. The peninsula remained divided, just as it was before the war, but the cost was staggering. Millions of people, mostly Korean civilians, had lost their lives. Cities were reduced to rubble. Families were permanently torn apart by the new, hardened border. For the United States, it was a forgotten war, overshadowed by World War II and the later Vietnam War, yet it claimed over 36,000 American lives. Today, South Korea has transformed into a vibrant, prosperous democracy and a global economic powerhouse. North Korea remains one of the world's most isolated and repressive totalitarian states. The DMZ is still the most heavily militarized border on Earth, a stark, daily reminder of a war that is, technically, still ongoing. The history of the Korean War is a powerful lesson about the devastating human cost of ideological conflict and the painful, enduring legacy of a nation divided. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this history interesting and want to learn more, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the events that have shaped our world. See you next time.